Welcome to Easy Listening with Nic and Ben.
Hello, Mr. Benjamin. Hey, it looks like somehow we've managed to survive 10 years, according to LinkedIn.
Yeah, according to I think on LinkedIn it was actually November, so we're past the 10-year mark, I think.
Yeah, I never know when to measure it, but it sort of popped up on LinkedIn a couple of days ago. I was on holiday, and then I was like, this is just the month now. This is the birthday.
Yeah.
It's the start of the year. So this episode is really just us going through our origin story and trying to figure out how we started and all the fun stuff, and maybe some of the controversial stuff, and maybe some of the crazy antics that have gone into making BowerBird over 10 years. And
So it's
survived.
for the BowerBird fanboys. It's for the people who are like, I really want to hear more. Andrew Chung,
from
looking in
Best
your
Cafe.
direction.
Yeah, from Best Cafe Designs. He posted a question on LinkedIn yesterday just going, is there an origin story of BowerBird? And I was like, no, should we be doing an origin story? Does anyone want to hear that?
I think if you follow all the stuff we've done, you can cobble together the origin story. But I think what's interesting is like with any milestone, like the 10-year mark, you look back and you go, oh, that's how far we've come. Whereas a lot of the stories we've told along the way were like, year 1, year 3, where we kind of still didn't know what we were doing.
Well, and the good thing about hitting 10 years is you've demonstrated that you can stay in the game. Like if you look at the Lindy effect, we should be around for at least another 5 years. So That's the good news for everybody out there, or the bad news, however you want to look at it. But so can you remember how we first met?
I'm pretty sure it was a tweet or Twitter. I think either I messaged you on Twitter or you messaged me on Twitter. You never know, do you? You never know who sent the first message.
That was a big Twitter phase when it was brand new. It was like 2010, 2011? No, 2012.
Yeah, 2012, 2013. I said 2012, I think, is when, like, if we go back through our Twitter messages, it's probably still there, saying who reached out to who. But I remember, so I was working freelance, doing some writing for a website or something. I'd just moved to Melbourne. And so when you first move to a city, you're like, anyone who wants to be friends with me, like, who wants to go for a coffee?
I think that was my headline too on Twitter. Let's grab a coffee.
Yeah. Well, true. So you probably were inviting people to contact you.
I used to meet a lot of random people. It was awesome though. Like I love doing that.
Same.
Yeah.
Because when did you come to Melbourne?
10? 20. I think it was 2010, 2011, something like that.
Yeah. So we're both relatively new to the city. Yeah. And we I think we just caught up with for a coffee. I think I was just like, look, you're a photographer. You're an architectural photographer. And I was writing about architecture, so let's connect. And then I can't remember that first coffee. Do you remember?
No, I can't remember the first coffee at all. And the next bit I remember is I had a little project called Websites for Architects. It was a 1-week project. I went back up to Cairns and I hung out at my mum's house. It was September. Remember, the weather was awesome. And I sat down for 5 solid days and just wrote what I called a web book, which was how to build a website for architects, because I was tired of all the architects building with Flash. The websites with the circles and you have to move and
which, just quietly, I still come across Flash websites. Well, not Flash, but the updated version of Flash. So I guess it's all of the awful things about Flash now in HTML5.
And that project was out. It was one of those tiny little things. And I think you came along and you were building websites at the same time.
Yeah, that's right. I was doing sort of project websites for people. So architects would come to me and I'd just feel like, oh, you just got to get your portfolio up. And back in those days, there was no Squarespace back then. It was all WordPress. So I'd built in WordPress and you built websites for architects in WordPress, right?
Yeah, it was all WordPress. Because it was, I think I built my first website, like no development experience, like can't code or anything. But it was the era when you had the drag and drop sort of stuff. And I remember the first website I tried to build as an architect for my little working by myself. And that was using something called Drupal.
Yeah.
And then, that sort of got surpassed by WordPress. And then WordPress seemed so much easier, which nowadays seems so hard compared to Squarespace and stuff like that.
Well, it's like if you want a lot of customization, then yeah, people probably still go to WordPress, but most people just want a storefront up. Yeah, it's almost like all that work you did on that ebook, not all of it, but so much of it is just like now you just get Squarespace, just use the Squarespace template.
Yeah, and even the work on that, that was that period when you don't really know what you're doing, but you're going to experiment with lots of ideas. And I see people doing that now. There's a phase where you're just trying to figure out how websites work or how marketing works or something else. And that was just one of those projects. And I shoved a heap of affiliate links on it, all going to Amazon. And it gave me a little bit of revenue to allow me to sustain myself for a little bit longer. But then I knew I didn't really want to get stuck being the dude making websites for architects, because that wasn't my niche.
Yeah.
But I do remember we tried to record a podcast. And
we did. I mean,
it's probably still there.
I hope those files are still there because it's going to be fun to listen back to. But honestly, I think a lot of it's probably still relevant. We should just be like, hey, we recorded this like 11 years ago and most of it's still relevant. I think we got into the weeds in some episodes where we were like, oh, this is a WordPress plugin and all that stuff, which won't be relevant anymore.
Yeah, a lot of that stuff went because it was all about SEO and the world was changing, and if you want to get customers, you better make sure you rank on Google and use this plugin, change these settings. This is how you do it. It's not that hard. You look back and you go, God, that's boring and, tedious. And but I think that came and went. And for some reason we were hanging out a bit. And then I was doing this other project because I was always doing a lot of projects, like, because I'd left architecture. I'd come down to Melbourne. I was working at the Institute of Architects, which was awesome. I got to meet all of these architects in Melbourne doing CPD, the professional development. So it was a really great community. And then I did that for 2 years and then jumped out to do photography because I just really enjoyed it. But I always knew that the photography as a business wasn't what I wanted to do forever either, because if you break your leg, your business stops. There was something there going, I like the process, except for maybe the early mornings. But, and so I was just playing with all this stuff. And that's where sort of I was playing with a PDF, like a media kit. Oh, you know who it was? It was Annie Reid. So,
that's right. Yeah.
So we're just going to name drop all the people who have helped us along the way.
Yep.
We'll omit all the names of the people who were standing in our way or trying to bring BowerBird down. But but the people who really helped us, I remember because I was photographing stuff and I didn't know what to do with the photos. Because the beauty of the BowerBird origin story really is we had no idea what we were doing at any step of the way and just making it up. And so I was going, how do I get my photos published? So I reached out to Annie Reid, who was a journalist, and she was writing, I think, The Australian and some of the newspapers, and then a few of the design publications too.
Yeah.
And I said, hey, I'm thinking about doing a podcast talking to journalists because, you're trying to do this hack where you can get somebody's time to be able to sit down with them. And so she took me up on that meeting, had a coffee with her at Fed Square. I just asked her, like, what's really annoying about getting published, or how do I get something published? And that's where she just said, look, all the back and forth sucks. Like, dealing with the architects, it takes way too long. Nobody has anything prepared. And so that's where I came up with the idea, like, so if I prepare a PDF or a media kit, will that help you? And she was like, yes, like, duh. Duh. And then having no idea what I was doing then and going, well, what's a media kit? Like, and you just think about this stuff now, you go, oh, actually, I know exactly what that is now. It's just the information around what your thing is. But it seemed daunting. Anyway, she helped me go through all the questions. Like I was asking, so what do you need to know? How does that work? How does that work? And that led to a PDF, which, again, went out to Twitter because Twitter was...
That's where everyone was hanging out.
Yeah, it was super cool then, with that little arrogant catchphrase, which is Australia's most followed architectural photographer, because there was nobody else on Twitter.
You did get in early, I gotta say. Like, as far as architecture goes, obviously. Actually, when did Twitter start?
I don't know. I think it was 2010, so it was really early.
Was that when Twitter started?
I have a feeling, or maybe it was a little bit before that. Actually, maybe 2009.
2006 it was
2006.
founded, but by 2012 had more than 100 million users. Yeah.
I remember the first time I heard a tweet and it sounded like the dumbest idea ever. Like, here's an app and you can write, 120 or 140 characters.
Yeah.
It's like, that's never going to take off. Who wants...
It'll never work.
It'll never work. There's a lesson in that for everybody there. Don't take our advice on anything.
In fact, if we tell you it's not going to work, keep going.
keep going. Anyway, I remember putting that PDF out, and it actually, people were like, "Oh, this is great. I want to download the PDF." And again, it was the era of like, how do you build a business out of this stuff? So I put it on a website and said, "Hey, you can buy this template, this amazing template."
Yeah.
And the problem with that was, what the hell do you do with it now? And which led to, I'll start creating a list of journalists. I'll start doing some research. And that list got bigger. And then I was like, looking back, it's obvious, but, what people forget is that up until 2005, there was no websites. So there was no Arc Daily and Design Milk. I think they were around 2005, 2006, around that era. So the internet exploded. And so we were like, this was 5 years after that. So the world has, like, the media landscape completely changed. And I was like, there's way too many publications here. Like, what's going on? And then trying to create a list and then going, this is too big. Or also going, there's opportunity here. Like, there was something there going, everybody else is stuck playing this game where there's one or two magazines in a country and there's one or two photographers and they have all the power. They own your work and it's a really controlled market and everyone's competing for like a handful of slots. And if you get the slots, back in the old days, you were everywhere. That's the only way people could find you. Anyway, me doing my little hacky brain, like, the way that you would hack Twitter or the way you would hack publishing, I was just doing the numbers and going, there's all these websites with audiences. The aggregate audience would always be larger than the audience of one magazine. And that's where originally I started putting everything to a database. And I think that's where MediaMap came along. And I think that's where you came along.
Yes. Yeah. So MediaMap, again, we did. I feel like that podcast for Websites for Architects was like an interview for you. You were just like, and then we fired off each other. Like, I bet if we go back and listen to those podcasts, it's very similar to what we do now. Like, we were able to bounce off each other, and the structure worked really well. And so I think once we'd had that first bit, I think that's when you kind of tentatively said, oh, I'm working on this other thing, or I've got this other thing. And when you described it to me, it was pretty much what you've just said. Like, it's a online media kit for architects.
Yeah. And what I did is I hacked WordPress.
Yep.
So not being able to, like, dabbling, like knowing just enough to be able to break something, and then being able to say, all I need to do is I need a big list of publications and journalists. And if I have that, I just need a way of organizing that. And then I remember I hired I have no idea how I did this because I was living on next to nothing for years as I was building these things. But I hired a virtual assistant because that was all the rage, back in the day. Like
Twitter virtual assistants, yep.
Following all of these hacky trends, like it's embarrassing to think about now. But I hired a virtual assistant to basically research the world's journalists or architecture for me. And I just somehow managed to find the money for them to keep doing that for months. And that's how I was going, there's thousands of publications here. And that led to the WordPress site. And I remember I think we were having beers. For some reason, it
Sounds
was...
about right.
I think you were working in the city of Melbourne.
Yeah, yep. Yeah, so I guess my origin story, how I got to that point. I trained as a journalist, worked at a small architecture and design publishing company up in Sydney, not so small anymore, but they're relatively small back then, called InDesign. And so obviously...
Which is pretty huge now, isn't it?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. I don't actually know how big they are, but big for a niche publisher, pretty big. But I remember, so this was 2008. So you kind of like, okay, that was around about Zine, Arc Daily, maybe they were a bit earlier than that. But there was that was the beginning of the wave of explosion of
What,
websites.
were you the web editor?
Yeah, that's what they do. So you come through the door and you go, you're young, and the InDesign Live, it was called, was their online version of their publication. And look, to be fair, like Raj, who is the publisher at InDesign, he was doing it before anyone else. He was taking it really seriously. So InDesign Live was a news website for essentially commercial interiors. Like, that is super niche to be going, okay, we're going to be the news website for that industry. And so, yeah, I walked through the door and it's like, there was, I think the founding editor came before me, Jess, and she'd been there for a couple of years. And then she moved on and they were just like, oh, you're here. I was an intern. It's like, you're here. Do you want a job? Yes. Throw the young person at it.
I've never asked you this, but it must have been, did it seem exciting at the time? Like,
incredibly.
Yeah.
Incredibly exciting. Like, I mean, it was, you're building something that doesn't really exist. Like, there weren't other people in Australia doing it at that stage, or not to the level that we were. And we were scrappy. We had no budget for editorial. I mean, not no budget, but, small budget for editorial. We found writers who would write for like half the print rate for online. It was an interesting time. But the great thing about it was we could publish content from all over the world. I think at that stage, their magazine was kind of just for Australia, but for us, we could publish news about interiors and products and all sorts of things from all over the world. But from day one, basically, I realized how hard it is to get content, like how hard it is to reach out to mainly interior designers back in those days, reach out to them and get photography and get all the information. You're doing a lot of work to get an article that's maybe 250, 300 words. Like, you didn't want to go longer than that because people wouldn't read it. And the back and forth to get that to work was so hard. And I remember another name as a shout out from my perspective was Andrew Maynard Architects, now Austin Maynard Architects. But Andrew Maynard, from way back then, he would put together press kits, and it would be on his website, and he would upload all the high-res images, all of the information. I think maybe someone in his practice was like a journalist or a marketer or something. And so you ended up with this package of content. And I used to go there first. If I was desperate for a story, I'd be like, okay, I'll just search. I'll go to Andrew Maynard first.
That crazy website, like the layout, which was all over the place. And I don't even know if the images and the text were like on the side or in different places.
That's the one. So yeah, the content was right. The website was quirky, let's say.
But big shout out to Andrew, because he was also some of my first photo shoots. And
Right.
So did a couple photo shoots of the Hill House, the recyclable table. There was a couple of things like that. And he was the one who I think was ahead of the game with the online stuff too. So I think we were both like looking at Andrew going, what's he doing? Like, that's interesting. Like, he was on Twitter really early. I mean, he's still doing stuff on Instagram with like traveling around the world. Archie Marathon. Yeah. So isn't it interesting when you piece together like the people within a community who inspire each other and sort of prompt an idea?
He's an interesting one. I think in the nicest possible way, he's opinionated, and we were in the early days as well. We were, open-minded. I think he's the same, like being open-minded, but also opinionated, also wanting to, talk about things. So for him, he was always talking about the running of his business. Like, he did this essay, I think it went on to Arc Daily or something, but it was basically a work-life balance essay.
Yeah.
And, that level of engagement when he was still relatively early in his practice. He also did the robot dog that walked around cities and
ate the city and then shut the materials out to recycle it.
Yeah, like, ideas based. He was really ideas based, and I still see that. Like, you see that in his practice still, which is really interesting. Yeah, but absolutely, you draw all those little connections that start to build up, all the synapses that connect up, and you go, oh, we were both looking at the same people, or interacting with the same people.
Yeah, just talking about like synergy or just coincidence. Like, Melbourne at that time was buzzing. Like, the amount of architecture, the amount of residential work, because I don't think that had always been in that city. It was like an era, which is probably still going, but this was the good times when there was plenty of work, lots of young architects who cut their teeth renovating terrace houses, and so there was just creativity everywhere. So being able to photograph stuff, and
we posited that, like, since then we sort of went, well, 2008, so that was the global financial crisis. And what we noticed happening was a lot of people were leaving or getting let go from large firms. So you had these big firms that had grown really large. I think particularly in Melbourne, they'd grown really, really large, and they had to let go of huge amounts of their workforce. And so you ended up with a whole heap of architects who were like, I've been burnt out by that. I don't want to work in a large practice anymore. And two, there was no work. Like, they had to make their own work. And I think that was where that explosion of smaller practices in Melbourne happened. So it was that moment in time where we came along and we were like, oh, there's all these amazing little practices who'd maybe been around for sort of 2 to 5 years. So they had a portfolio of work and they were trying to figure out what to do with it.
Yeah, like BowerBird really is a story of something that happens in a like time and place. Like if we were tried to do it 20 years earlier or 20 years later, it wouldn't have been relevant. Like the other things were things like digital photography were coming online. So it was easier to take photos. Now you've got more projects being built, more projects being photographed. Now you've got all the online publications. So there's more places for it to flow out to. You've got an ecosystem here, which is really firing. And like, we'll probably tell more of this story as we go around the world with the launch of BowerBird. But what we didn't realize at that time was that Melbourne was a hub. Like in the world of architecture, it was buzzing. The sheer quantity, like we would, over the years, we've had entire teams researching architects and analyzing where stuff is happening in the world. Melbourne has a really high concentration of really high quality architecture. And we just happened to be sat there drinking beers and met each other in this city. And all these pieces just sort of happened to be there.
Well, it is so funny because we kind of perhaps naively extrapolated what was happening in Melbourne and went, oh, this must be happening all over the world. And I think if we'd have had if we'd have had the ability to crunch through the data, we would have realized that places like the US, where you go and have a look at the number of architects and it's, hundreds of thousands, and you think, oh, well, if that's the same ratio of what we call publishable work, so work that could be published by the journalists that we interacted with, then, oh my God, the US must be huge. In reality, I'd say the US and Australia are kind of on par with the amount of publishable architecture.
So coming back to, we had MediaMap. So MediaMap launches around 2014. It's a WordPress site. I think it's like $50 a month or $29 a month. How do we come up with the pricing? I don't know. That's what an app is worth. So we don't know how to run a business.
No, that's not fair. You were smarter than that. You worked out, you'd done back of the napkin sums on how many users. I think back then it was still a side hustle, like for both of us, really. It was just like, okay, this might just be a really good side hustle. And so we were like, man, if we were getting like $2,000 a month off the back of this each, amazing. Like, woohoo, we're rich.
I remember trying to go sell this to architects in the early days and just go, look, I've got this amazing tool. I've got a list of thousands of publications. Would you give me $1,000 for that list? Like, just this, it's a terrible idea. But people would like, well, maybe like they could see the value, but that business would have fallen over within about, 3 customers. But we had MediaMap. This is all on WordPress. It's hacked together and people start using it, which is the bad thing because this thing is going to explode. We've just, a website is not the same as an app. Like you don't manage things in the same way. Anyway, I don't know how it came about, but there was some point where we're talking and I said, I think I should try to rebuild this in a proper app way.
I think you've skipped over some of the really interesting origin story stuff. So we used to work from Docklands Library. It was a brand new fancy library that had been built down in Docklands by
the Clares.
Yeah,
that's right. Which
you knew through the institute, I guess, was it?
No, I knew them because being a photographer and on Twitter, I got hired by Euromedia by Matt to go do a book around Australia to photograph 20 leading architects for there was a recruitment company and
Bespoke?
No,
Really?
it's another one.
Okay.
But anyway, I got to go on this crazy journey and go meet all these cool architects and go interview them in their homes and things. And so, anyway.
So we managed to find this library, which is essentially like it's as fancy as any co-working space that's out there at the moment, but almost no one was down there because it was in Docklands and there was hardly anyone living in Docklands. And so we used to sit there up on the first floor, I guess, looking out at these multi-million-dollar yachts parked in the marina there, and pretend that we pretended we were, we played rich for a bit.
That was our scrappy co-working space. We were completely free. Yeah. And I remember we would meet every Friday. That's what it started off as, because we were busy doing our other things. We were busy either doing photos or writing or trying to scrap together. I think I was doing workshops and all. Like at the time, it was we would do anything we could to make sure that we could stay in the game and keep working on this project. Yeah, that was a fun time.
Well, and I remember, again, in the early days when you're trying out all sorts of things, we did an offer for a workshop, and I think it was $350 or something to come to this workshop and learn how to get published. We're just like, we needed money, basically. We needed some cash coming through. And I remember it failed. I would say it failed dramatically, except we did get one person who paid for it, and it was Dan Gafer. Do you remember Dan Gafer?
Yes.
So he's still going. He's an interior designer, but he paid up front, and we went, look, no one else has bought a ticket to this thing. So do you want to come and just meet with us? We'll just give you like a few hours of our time and set you up. And we gave him a subscription to MediaMap as well.
Didn't we go to his house?
Eventually, we saw him a few times. I ended up living around the corner from his house, but yeah, we went to his house and checked it out. He designed it.
Yeah. And we've got some of the early users, we probably should mention a few of them as we go through, like Tandem Design Studio. Yeah, I think they would technically use the number one, but I can't remember if it was MediaMap or BowerBird. It was one of the two. But I think that was because I had done photos with Tandem, had shown James what I was working on, and he was just super enthusiastic and supportive of just everybody and everything.
He's the definition of an early adopter. Like because I think there were other tech companies that started up around architecture in Melbourne, and it's just you'd always see his name or Tandem popping up. He knows you get in early, you get a good price.
And anyway, so we're running this stuff. It's all going through WordPress, which just kind of sucks. But I can't remember if was that before we started running awards, or did we run awards through the MediaMap system?
No, I don't think we can't have. We couldn't have. No, so 2000, I think I think we started rebuilding, or you started rebuilding. You went, okay, we're going to try a new language, which was Rails.
Ruby. Yeah, Ruby and Rails. Like, I have no idea how to code at this point. It's just like, surely how hard can it really be?
I still don't know. I mean, it's easy from my point of view. So at some point there we went, I mean, obviously, so 2014, and then we launched BowerBird, so the new version in, I think, June of 2016. And so I think the first awards we did, and now I'm like so confused, but yeah.
And we missed something. There was this really, in the beginning, maybe the WordPress site was already up because I'd shown you, here's the WordPress thing and it's functioning or something. You see it. I think we sat down having a beer and you were the first person I had shown it to, and you got it. Like, because I had shown it, I think I'd shown it to a couple architects, and they were a bit skeptical. Like, I don't understand it, or, this sounds like Twitter, in 2006, what? You're just going to write 140 characters?
Yeah.
But your eyes lit up. And then I remember we met up about a week later, and you had prepared this little document. And I think on the document, and this is your city of Melbourne. It's at the bar downstairs.
Yeah.
Harry Birds or something. What was it called?
Harry's little sister, I think it was.
Something like that. And you prepared this little document, and basically it just said 2 heads are better than one. And it was like, okay, we'll give this a try. We'll try to start. But at this point, we don't have a company. We don't know how companies work. We have no structure. We have nothing. But somehow over those next couple of years, I think we saw a lawyer. We set up a company. We we found a startup lawyer who just did it all for us, and suddenly we were so lucky in some ways.
We should name drop him as well.
Yeah, General Standards.
General Standards. What's
With
his name again?
Kurt.
Totally. Kurt.
Is it Kurt?
Kurt at General Standards. Yep.
Kurt.
And what we loved about him was he'd productized his services. So when you're a startup, you're like, I don't want to spend, I don't want to be having a lawyer or a retainer. I don't want to be spending thousands of dollars. And he just came along and said, cool, this is how much we charge for setting up a company. This is how much we charge for, shareholder agreement, whatever it was. And it was just like, great, we can just pay that money and then we're set up and don't have to think about it again.
We should also give a big shout out to Illuminate, who came on much later, but they're our accountants. Same vibe. Productized services, makes everything fun and straightforward. Like all of those early people that, support BowerBird, we are still working with them, even though that we're larger and things have changed. And big shout out. But yeah, I remember we did all of that. And then we go, okay, we're going to rebuild this because this is going to blow up. And we couldn't build features. Like we couldn't do anything. I think that was
it. I think it was the frustration of going, we kind of hit as far as we can go, and this thing's only just started. So it was like, oh, imagine if you could do this and this and this.
Yeah, we're always hacking things, like just simple stuff like, if you want to log in, you can use this plugin, but then you have to do it the way they want to do it. Like,
I feel like that period was a lot of you with your head in your hands going, I've gone down this path of trying to hack something, and then I find out that there's a critical reason that I can't do the next thing. And you were just like, it's just not sustainable.
Yeah, in hindsight, it's harder. It's a bit like trying to make a car into a boat rather than just building a boat.
Yeah.
But I remember we starting to learn Rails, writing all of that, and then did that for 12 months. And I remember I must have been in Abbotsford. We sat down and had a coffee. There was a little coffee shop. I remember there was a courtyard. And I said, Ben, I've built all of this. I think I should start again. Like after you're waiting on the sidelines, can we finally launch this thing? And it was because, it worked, but it was hacky. And it was this platform built by somebody who's never done any of this before.
It was your learning, like rebuilding it was like your learning process. It was like the test project.
And I maybe it was because of that experience with WordPress going, if we launch this, we're going to be redoing this again just in 12 months because...
But on the fly with something that had already launched. Yeah. Was, I think that was it. I think in the early days, we were risk averse. I mean, I still think we are risk averse generally, which is hilarious because we're, a startup doing all these crazy things. But generally we are naturally risk averse. And I think that's what, like, I remember that conversation as well. Remember it like it was yesterday. And it was, I think it was a moment of, you explained really clearly. Cause like, I had a little bit of understanding of coding, but not to the nowhere near the extent that you had developed in that time. You kind of went, look, we could do this, but it's not going to end well, basically. And also, I think your pitch was something like, okay, so it may take us I reckon this time around it's going to take me like 3 months to redo the code and start from scratch. Like you were ambitious in how much faster you would be able to do it. And I remember just going, you know what you're doing. Like, let's just do it. But yeah, totally frustrating to throw out a whole heap of code. And yeah.
Well, yeah, in hindsight, it was a good decision, which we've generally done. We generally take long-term decisions. And, for complete transparency, we're not a funded startup. We have funded every single thing we've built here has come from either freelancing in the beginning, like doing 2 jobs, doing this on the side, working on the weekends, to getting the first subscription, staying within our budgets. We can only hire the people that we can pay. There's zero funding anywhere. And somehow 10 years on, and it works.
It's so funny. Just as you say that, I was like, there's another person we need to give a shout out to, and that's Eleni Arbus from Creative Spaces. And the city of Melbourne, because just these random things that happen. So this would have been in between 2014 and 2016, I guess. I was working at City of Melbourne Creative Spaces, looking after their website, basically we were rebuilding it. So it was really complementary to the work that you and I were doing as well. But then I decided that I was going to go away for 12 weeks.
And it was having your honeymoon.
Yeah, it's honeymoon. That's right, honeymoon. So we were traveling for 12 weeks, and I said to Eleni, look, I understand if you can't hold my job, this trip's happening, but I'd love to come back if I can. And she was like, well, if you can find someone to fill in for you. And I'm sitting there going, oh, Nic, would you be interested in taking over my job?
Well, and at the time I was like impoverished. I'm trying to sustain myself doing 1 or 2 photo shoots a month. My credit card is, we don't want to talk about how big there was like $30,000 on a credit card trying to sustain the startup.
Yeah.
There's a lot of stress. And then you're going, hey, I know we're coming into winter. I remember that, and just going, winter sucks in Melbourne to take photos because you lose all your blue skies. And you're like, do you want to do this job for 6 weeks? And I was like, yeah, let me get some dollars coming through. And then, but I also stayed in your house.
I can't remember. The stars aligned. Had you decided you wanted to move or something, and then you're like, oh, actually, this is perfect because I don't need to.
I had been in an apartment with my mate. I'd gone through a breakup 2 years beforehand. He'd gone through a breakup. And so I had jumped into the spare room. He then now had a new partner and it was getting a bit tight with the 3 of us in the apartment. So I was kind of pushed out going, I need to go find somewhere to live. Like, it was just all the chaos when you're trying to start something. You're not stable. Your income's not stable. Nothing is stable, but you're just trying to push through because I guess you believe that good things will come from building stuff. And in those days, I had 100% faith in it.
I think there was obviously, we have complementary personalities, whatever. We've been doing this for 10 years, the longest relationship.
That's always our line.
I think that level, like, I can't imagine doing something like this without that. Like, I mean, I can see, and obviously you did it for quite a while. Like, you were on that sort of startup trajectory before we met, but I don't know, there's just something about if you find that person to carry half the load really makes a difference. You are not alone.
It's a sanity
in that
check.
journey.
I think you get to talk through stuff with somebody else who has skin in the game. It's not the same as talking to somebody on the outside because they don't understand the pressures. They don't understand the details. They're trying to be supportive, but it's this superficial support. Whereas when we talk, it's like we're both in the same boat. It's like we're going to figure out how we solve this problem to be able to keep moving forward. I think one of the best things is that even though there have been some very hard times, we have always maintained a good friendship. Like, we still hang out and have a good laugh. Like, we go traveling halfway around the world for weeks at a time, and we're quite happy doing it. Like, you'd think we'd get tired of each other after 10 years.
But but we also, this is the thing, we figured out, I mean, I guess, like, I know we're sort of jumping around now, but I feel like, you started doing the things that you're doing, so websites for architects and then through to MediaMap and BowerBird, because you wanted your life to be a certain way, right? You wanted to have work be exciting and, unpredictable in some ways. Like, you didn't want to just look at, because I remember you said, you came to me and you said, I got out of architecture because I was sitting there in the office and I was sort of planning out my 4 weeks of holidays for the rest of my life, for the rest of my working life. And I just went, I do not want that. Right. And I feel like that's the seed of, well, hang on, I don't want to do things the traditional way. And that's where everything sort of snowballed. But it's the same for me. It's like this job after 10 years is still as exciting, if not more exciting, than the first, that first meeting where we talked about it.
100%. It's like, it's hard. Like, it's not easy sailing your own boat because, you don't have all the protection. When you work in another company, a lot of the outside world is protected from you. You might lose your job, but then you go jump into somebody else's boat. They protect you and you just keep moving around. But yeah, 100%. It's, I love the adventures that BowerBird has created, which we'll probably dig into. There are some great ones there as we jump around the world.
Well, I guess if we go back chronologically, where we left off when we went on that tangent was I think 2016 and the Institute, the Victorian chapter of Architects.
Yeah. I think maybe we relaunched BowerBird in 2016, and somewhere we partnered up with the Victorian chapter of the Australian Institute of Architects because of Alison Clary.
2017. So it would have been the beginning of 2017 was the award.
Yeah, because we must have BowerBird technically. Oh, we forgot to talk about how we changed the name. So
yeah, but it's just go.
So it's a quick story, but look, all it was we were tired of MediaMap because it felt too technical and we didn't know what it could become, and we wanted a name which was more flexible and maybe more startup vibe. We were at the Pinnacle in Fitzroy North. We were having a couple pints of beer and we were just like, maybe we should change the name, like just randomly, and then started searching through domain names. And I think that afternoon we just bought the domain name and said, okay.
I have a feeling, and I could be wrong, but I remember maybe someone else had suggested the name at some point, or there was a previous discussion, because I feel like you brought the name to that conversation as a sort of, oh, well, there's this, not feeling it. And I remember just going, wait, that's fantastic, because for anyone who doesn't know, a bowerbird is an Australian native bird. Australian, Aussies, we like those sorts of things. But it's a bird that goes around and collects little bits of blue things like blue plastic, blue flowers, and it creates a nest, which is called a bower. And I remember just going, well, that's what architects and designers are. And it's what journalists are. Journalists are collecting all these little stories, putting it together in a beautiful magazine publication. Architects are getting all the little bits of information and products and everything and creating a house. And I just went, that is perfect. And I think it took you, like, you were always like, well, that's not the origin story of the name. That was like this reverse engineering thing. You were just like, it was just a good name with the domain that was available.
Yeah, I always tell the boring story. You've always got a much better version of it. Like, there's all this meaning and there's like purpose.
But there was
with the
to
name.
me. I think what's really interesting about that is that name when it came in. It was actually a pub crawl. I don't know if you remember this, but I think we started off at the Pinnacle, and then went to two other pubs in Fitzroy North, and then came back to the Pinnacle, and we went, yeah, BowerBird, that's it. So let's buy the domain and go for it.
So the secret here for anybody listening at home is make sure you get drunk before you make major decisions about the naming of your company.
Yeah. And we've since both gone through Alcoholics Anonymous program. There were a lot of, like, there's this thing I mentioned actually on LinkedIn the other day, what we called walk and talks, which was if we had a problem that was tricky, it probably just came from the fact that we never really had a proper office. So we're always walking around the city. But yeah, if there was a problem that we wanted to nut out, we didn't understand how something could work, we would often just go, look, let's just go grab coffee, go for a walk. And quite often those walk and talks would last, hours and end up on a bit of a pub crawl. But that was, honestly, that's how we sustained the excitement as well. We'd have an idea, we'd go, maybe we could solve it like this. And then we'd sort of spiral and then get really drunk. And the next day you wake up with a hangover, but you go, hey, that idea was good.
Well, and some of those ideas are now coming into reality 10 years later. Like you mentioned this on LinkedIn, where we were exploring things because, we didn't know anything about running a network with, tens of thousands of people all over the world and what memberships are or subscriptions or virality, or we had no idea how any of that worked. So we were having to talk through it and say, what if you do this? What, in hindsight, you go, well, that's what you do as a startup. That makes sense. But it was kind of like, it was fun to dream because it gives you something in the distance, something crazy to sort of aim towards. And I think we've always, we still do it. I mean, we talk once a week. We just have a meeting where we ramble around, what if we could do this? And that is, to us, that's kind of fun. And now we get to build it.
Yeah. And I think, in those early days, we had very few resources to be able to do what we wanted to do. So, I think the example was Autopilot, a feature that we've just launched, that, like, I really remember that from the very early days, just going, imagine you could do this and this. And that was the only way that, in hindsight, the only way that was ever going to happen would be if AI has done what it's done, right? Without AI, you couldn't really have built something scalable.
But where the origin of all of that came from is we've launched this thing. We've built this amazing platform. The architects can build media kits. We've got all the journalists and the publications there. And then there's a button that says submit. And then we're watching the architects and they won't press the submit button. You just go.
In the early days, I remember one of the walk and talks was, how do we get these people to press submit? And we came up with, like, we didn't end up implementing it, but we need to trick them into doing it. Like, it's kind of like you click next and it goes, great, we've submitted it for you. And, you needed to get them past that fear of what happens when I send this thing out. But honestly, until until autopilot, we still had people who have that reluctance to send out their projects.
Because we had all the data on the back end, and we could see the people who submitted more got published way more.
Shocking. How surprising.
That's surprising. It makes sense. And then we'd have these architects come along and we're like, you have a really awesome project. You want to send this out to the world, but you're scared. And when we came across that, we realized, this is not just a practical tech problem. This is not just numbers. This is about psychology. Like, there was a big shift between MediaMap and BowerBird. MediaMap had a lot of data. We were trying to mathematically demonstrate how you would get published the most. And we'd look for the audience size of publications, and we'd do all this stuff. And because in my mind, I was going, I want the maximum audience when I publish something. And then we realized architects don't want that. They're not experts in this. It's too complicated. What we need is that could be all in the background, doing all the maths and stuff, but they just want something that's super simple. And so we started to work down a very different path of going, don't talk about the numbers, talk about the success, or talk about something else, but not data.
Well, I don't know when did another name to mention is OOF architecture, Fui Linku.
Yeah. Well,
when did that happen? When was Hello House?
I think that was maybe 2017. I remember how it happened though, because we were talking to Archi Team, and I had just done a talk at Archi Team around getting published in media kits. And I was walking down Swanston Street, because I think it was held somewhere in the city, and Fui there with her spiky hair. And she started chatting to me and saying, do you want to maybe take some photos or something? And then I ended up photographing some of her projects, and we've been friends ever since. And we've used her projects throughout the world for the Hello House and the Acute House.
Yeah, I mean, that to me, that the Hello House is still the first. I'm seeing when it actually was. Yeah, 2018. To me, that was like the first project. I think it was the first project where it kind of went viral, right?
Yeah.
So it's this white brick rear extension to a Victorian shop house sort of thing in Melbourne, and it's got the words "hello" on the side. And the story was so great as well, because the artwork on the outside, made from bricks that are inset, it was designed by the owner of the house. So it's just this perfect little story as well that went along with it. It said hello to the street. The idea was they wanted to be generous to the neighborhood. So it was literally a house that says hello. And to me, that story and the fact that it went viral, partly the images, obviously, with big hello, but that to me was like, oh, this works. When you get the recipe right, it works, and it works in a really big, meaningful way.
Yeah, it was so true. And it was just, we were lucky. Again, a lot of these things, and maybe you make your own luck because you're busy doing things and good things come to you and you have the pieces. But because we had that project, we had the photos, because I'd photographed it, we had all the copyright, we had Fui on board, and then we had the platform there to launch it. Everything just aligned, and I was like, yes, okay, we've now demonstrated that the theory works. Like, yeah. I remember there was a phrase, I never really articulated it properly, but it was going, the world had changed. It's not about getting published in the singular. It was always about getting published in the plural. Like, the game was, you need to get published as many times as you can. It's like, I think we always envisioned this map of the world and how the story of a piece of architecture would spread, and we could see it. You would get published in this publication, so there's an audience there, or you get published in the US, and these stories would move, and you're trying to get the snowball to keep going. And that was always, in our minds, that's what BowerBird is meant to do. It's meant to trigger that virality and get it out to as many places as possible, so that people find out about your story and your work.
Yeah, and I think that, you mentioned Archi Team. So I'd say Archi Team and the Vic chapter were the Vic chapter of the Australian Institute of Architects. They were the game changers for us. So Archi Team is a collective of small practices, basically. And, the idea was that small practices have unique needs, and the Institute perhaps represents, larger practices, a huge breadth. So Archi Team was like, well, we need to figure out a way to get cheaper insurance ultimately for these smaller sort of solo practices, smaller practices. But they serve a very similar function. and they both had awards. So the AIA has these awards, and your friend Alison,
Well, she used to be my old boss. So when I worked at the Institute for 2 years. And so Alison came in that second year. Then I went off to do photos, and I was coming back and doing like the awards photos each year. So I was always involved with the awards a little bit. And I think Libby was there running the awards. So anyway, I pitched them on the idea. And the idea was, you've got all this awards content. It's very similar to what a media kit is. What if we ran this campaign, and if we could get all of the projects that run through an award and get the architects to turn them into media kits, we can distribute them to the world. The idea being we could really catapult Australian architecture out to the world because nobody had done this. And that was always the game. It was always fun playing with social media and seeing how you could, I guess, tap into a new way of doing things. So yeah, so that one worked. I still think that was probably one of the largest international media campaigns the Institute's ever run, because you had 200 projects all running out at once to all the publications around the world.
Well, I mean, I've got the blog post that we did was sort of the report afterwards. So there were 16 stories that were specifically covering the awards program. So this is the Victorian chapter, just the Victorian chapter, and the number of articles, including like large consumer publications like domain.com.au and the design files, where it was, they'd not really ever had this level of coverage before. So I think they used to pay for a spread in the Age, but they didn't have the funding to do that in that particular year. But then on top of that, we were able to track the projects that were featured, and there was like over 160 stories that were generated, project stories that were generated from that partnership, and they'd never done that before. They'd never given that extra value to members. It was essentially a no-brainer.
That was crazy. And I remember that's also what triggered the need for us to go international, because what had happened was we had connected with these publications around the world, and we were sending them so much Australian content, and they were like, can you get us content from other places?
Which can you do this in X city?
Yeah, which is the next chapter of this story. So if you're still listening and we're at 1 hour, it gets more fun. But we did the Vic chapter awards. Then I think we went to Architeam and said, why don't we do something similar? And Architeam we love. They are just so open and friendly, and we still help them any way we can and support them, and they're great. And then I remember the second year, I don't think we ran it with the Vic chapter. There was I think Alison had left, and then there was a change of command, and there was always this funny game where this is the background, never been told before, but I think all the states, almost every state chapter manager had come on board saying, we want to run the campaign, because we said, why don't we run this nationally? This could be huge for Australian architecture. If we could get hundreds and hundreds of projects and content ready to publish, this could go viral all over the world. And somebody higher up killed it, and we could never find out what was going on. And it was basically just shut down, and everybody was told that they couldn't participate in the program anymore. It was like, that was one of those first hard moments where you're going, what's happened here? Like,
I think in a way it was the first time we felt like there were people, like, it's one of those reaffirming things where you're going, okay, if people are annoyed enough to shut something down, to stop you from doing something, then you're probably doing something that's a threat to someone.
Yeah.
Like we don't know the story. Like we've heard little rumors, but we don't know the story.
Yeah.
But I think there was that moment of like, okay, well, they're not going to do it. I mean, also Architeam had none of that, none of that bureaucracy. And they were just like, yeah, this is amazing. So I think when we ran their awards, I think we ran that for at least 4 years, and we did those awards, and those small practices from Melbourne, particular, but Sydney as well, got so much media coverage through the partnership with BowerBird. So much.
And it's so funny. Like, in some ways it broke my heart, because I had volunteered with the Institute. I'd worked with the Institute. I really had, like, it was part of my DNA for many years. And then realizing the world isn't all happy games and, kumbaya.
It's not all roses. Yeah.
It's not all roses. But there was this irony too, which is, over the years we've run awards programs all over the world. Like, we partner with the World Architecture Festival each year. We've run campaigns all over every continent, maybe except Antarctica. There was always this.
There's been talk though. I'm hearing rumors.
It's huge. It's huge. Scott's Hut is going to be a big winner.
That's the next big thing. Yeah.
And it was always weird going, starting off in Melbourne is where there was with different parts of the community, because we were changing things, and I guess people knew who we were. We never really had that overseas. Like, as we expanded, it was always coming back home was a bit like there's a battle going on behind the scenes.
I mean, to get, there's a little bit of background, which is when you were a photographer, you started basically without realizing it, you were poking the hornet's nest, right?
Yeah, okay. So the background was, I'm coming in, I'm naive, I'm picking up a camera, but I'm coming from the perspective of the architect. And what I saw was there's all these photographers with these really draconian licensing agreements, which back in the day, a photographer might license to be published in one magazine or one medium. Social media was new, so they might lock down social media and say you can't get published there, because in the old days, as a photographer, you would get paid by a print magazine. So they were saying, if Facebook's not paying me, you can't publish there. And in my mind, I'm going, you've lost all this opportunity. There's all these websites, but the world has changed. It's not about getting paid for that one article. Yeah, it's not being, because you're not sending film. Like, it's not this laborious process, and it's not the same as, I guess the replication is what was giving you value. Because I was watching all of these YouTubers who were photographers. They were 10 years ahead of where architecture was. People like Chase Jarvis, where they're talking about, this is the time where you want to get the exposure. Don't worry about the money. Get out there as big and as wide as you can. And they were winning. Any of the photographers who did that, who shared the information, it was like, the stonemasons, don't talk about anything. And then suddenly whoever talks about it rockets, because the game had changed. So I came along and I just said, I need a point of difference. So I'm going to have a media-friendly license. Basically, as an architect, if I photograph your work, you pay me up front. I don't want to chase licensing fees. I don't want to sign 100 forms giving permission to use the photos. Just go use them, because if you get published more, you raise my profile. Like, I'll get more work. Like, the idea of locking down a publication so that I could make $200. I was just going, this is dumb. Well, like, why would anybody want, this is me being naive and just brash.
Idealistic, perhaps.
Idealistic.
Let's say that, yeah.
And, but what I didn't realize is, there's a community of existing photographers who had grown up on this with a heritage of defending copyright, which they had fought for maybe the last 100 years to defend the control of their photos. And they saw this as a threat, but also there was a collective trying to controlling the market there. And that's,
I think it's, it's also important to sort of recognize the history of, so because architectural photography, is sort of this art form as well. So, you're capturing someone else's art form, which is the architect, right? But copyright, the reason copyright exists essentially is that you can only make money off the reproduction, right? So if you're creating art, then you are the one who's investing the time, unless it's been commissioned. You're the one doing the work and putting all of that effort in up front, and then only when you sell it can you make a living, right? So that's why copyright exists. You don't want someone just ripping your stuff off and selling it, right? And I think that dynamic's changed in lots of places around society now. But what we always, like exactly where you've come from, it made a lot more sense to kind of charge more up front to the person who gets the most value from it, which is the architect, because it's their only way of marketing the work that they do.
Yeah, and what we also saw was that market was getting larger. So rather than feeling like it was a zero-sum game and you had to protect your sort of piece of the pie, what we saw was there's all these extra publications and they need content. You need more photographers in a city providing more content, making it more open to feed those publications who now drive the architects to being able to get more work. It was all beneficial, but you needed the flow to occur. And any barrier there was actually impeding sort of the process of getting published.
Well, but, and I think the irony was, so there was that group of photographers who, or let's just say I think all over the world as well. There were people who were kind of like, oh, look, we want things to stay as they are. And that's totally normal, right? It's totally normal to go, look, I benefit from the way things are. I want to keep it the way they are. So that, yeah, there were sort of a group, a little bit of union, unofficial unionization, perhaps.
Well, I call it the mafia, the photography mafia. Like the idea that you were going to gang together and we're going to try and price control and, behind the scenes, like one of the things that always pissed me off was, because we hear a lot of stories, we hear everyone's stories, but you hear like a young architect who would hire the best photographer, and then behind the scenes, that photographer is preventing that architect from being published unless they get a second fee. And there was a lack of transparency in that whole market. And we saw that, and it was just like, coming from the architectural side, I was going, this is wrong. Like, if you're going to do that, make it open, like be transparent. But it was particularly with the young architects because they had no power. The larger firms, who would probably be happier to pay much higher fees and do all of that, that game didn't get played in the same way, because you don't want to piss off the really big, important architects in the city. So, and again, we've always been in this position where we probably know more about an architectural community than anybody else in the world, like, because we spend so much time talking to people, lots of people. And so we just saw it as there's opportunity somewhere for everybody to win, and there's a more moral way of going about that. And that's just the natural change of how industries work and how they change and so forth.
And I think that, there's a lot of good things that came out of, like, forged in fire, but there are a lot of good things that came out of that, like even features on the app that were really useful to us ultimately. So, again, a bit naively in the early days, we didn't have any sort of access control. And the photographer basically called us up, and we had a good conversation with him. And Nick was like, you were like, I'll build this today.
Well, I think the way it actually works is that we get these long letters with veiled threats and about, all the nasty things that people want to do to us. And then what we do is we always try and talk to people. And
pick up the phone.
We would pick up the phone and we would listen to somebody, and we would try to understand where they're coming from. And often I think it was they saw us, they perceived us as some big startup as a company, like this faceless organization. And as soon as they hear a real person who's working hard, trying to do something, and who's actually trying to be empathetic, trying to understand where they're coming from and what their issue is, I think a lot of the time, there was times when we built new features because we said, that's a great idea. We want to help doing that. And other times I think they wanted to be able to talk to somebody because they felt like the world was changing around them and it was hard and it was scary. And some of those photographers are now our friends. That I love the people who it started off where there was tension or a battle. Yeah. And then we would fly into different cities and we would go meet with the people who hate us. And now they're really good friends. And you go, it's just like the misunderstanding of how this works. And
you have to build the trust, and that's totally fair. Like, if someone doesn't trust you, they're gonna question your motives. And I think the moment we met with people and said, look, it really was, we're trying to grow the pie here. We're not trying to, take advantage of anyone at all. Like that's not going to work. You can't grow a pie by taking advantage of a group of people. It just doesn't work.
Yeah. Anyway, so we had all of that. So this is this early stage where we're getting the success, but at the same time, we're getting sideswiped a little bit by groups or people, or, there's a bit of a rockiness there. And at the same time, things are going really well. Like we're growing quite quickly and going, we need to get out of this country. We need to get out of Australia. Yeah. Before we get there though, who we haven't mentioned is the Commons.
Oh yeah.
So we were always working from home, and Ben, you were working at Creative Spaces, and the Commons popped up on the website there. And you were like, hey, maybe we should.
They were like brand new. They just opened up. So they'd opened up in this warehouse space in Collingwood, which is just outside the CBD in Melbourne. And it was designed by 6 Degrees architects, which are just iconic Melbourne architects. And it was like, that sounds like it could be good for us. Let's go check it out.
Because it was the old Swiss Vitamins HQ. And so we were one of the first people in there within the first few weeks of opening. And we still hang out there years later, thanks to Cliff and Tommy.
Yes. But, I like what we often talk about, our journey being, parallel. So they're doing very different things. So they're creating these co-working spaces, and maybe in the early days they had dreams of being a bit more like WeWork, but ultimately what they've done is they've grown at a really sustainable rate. I think they're up to 12 locations or something like that now, but just in Melbourne and Sydney. And so I think there was sort of this commonality there of like, wanting to do big things, but also wanting to stay within our means. And in the early days, it was kind of like being in almost like a frat house, like some of the things that happened in that place. Like there was beer on tap and ping pong tables and all those things, all those startup trappings.
It felt like a startup. Like,
yes, yeah.
It was exciting and it was fun. And I do remember it in the beginning going, well, we're going to spend money on a desk. I've already got a desk at home, like being so cheap. And then going, this seems like a lot of money, which was not a lot of money if you had a real business at the time that was making revenue. But all of our revenue, we were just plowing straight back into BowerBird to try to make it better and to get to that next level. Because we were still working then. We were still doing other jobs and like photography and writing.
Quite a while, actually, I think, after moving in there. In fact, you know what? We were paying for our own desks from our freelance work.
Yeah.
So the company wasn't even paying for the company wasn't even paying for the desks. I think we paid ourselves back.
I remember it wasn't until years later that we actually got paid a wage from the company. We ran BowerBird for years as, I guess, sustained by something else and just hoping that it would grow into something which would eventually give us jobs. But the reason I bring up Commons is because that's where we met Chris. And Chris was sitting in our row. We had a row, we had sort of these open desks, and Chris was this Canadian. And this is how we...
Just some Canadian.
He was some Canadian. He was working for a tech company. He'd been sent over to Australia. He was doing sales. So we would overhear him talking to customers. And at the time, we were terrible at sales. We had no idea how to do sales. It seemed like this magical thing that people do. And we heard him doing sales. And anyway, he eventually goes back to Canada. And I don't know how this happened, but I said, I think we should see if Chris wants to come and be part of BowerBird. I think he had already gone back.
Yeah, he had. Or I think he was traveling. I think you spoke to him when he was still traveling, but he was planning on staying in Canada. Yeah.
That's right. I think the pitch was, do you want to try and sell this in Canada? Like, we don't know how to get overseas. Like, because getting overseas, we take it for granted now. Like, we're all over the world. But for most companies, it's a really big jump to try to get outside of your own country. Like, it's just the logistics and the distances and the time zones and, trying to run things remotely. This is before everybody jumped on remote. We were trying to figure out how to do this. Like,
there was no Zoom didn't really exist. Like, I think Google Hangouts was the best, and people just didn't want to get on a Google Hangout. They didn't want to be on video. So Chris is over there and he's trying to do sales and he has no structure. There is, starting from ground zero. Well, it's funny because he decided that he wanted to live in Montreal, and
that's right.
That was not that wasn't a target area for us or anything. It was just like, okay, so here's Chris in Montreal, doesn't speak a word of French or very little French at all, which for anyone who knows Montreal is just like you basically can't function in the city. So I think I can't remember whether he I think he might have got a job in a bar or something to sort of sustain him until he could start to make some money. But ultimately, what we hadn't realized was that that's where V2Com is. So V2Com, very different sort of trajectory to BowerBird, sort of coming out of a PR agency background.
They had a newswire. Yeah, they had a like old school newswire, so a big mailing list. Like, you're going to send out to 30,000 emails that you somehow have found. And he turns up and he's like just down the street from the only other product which might be comparable to BowerBird. It was hilarious. It's just like out of all the places.
And he found out he bought coffee from the same shop. But look, the reality of it was that he didn't speak French. He wasn't going to be able to build his networks in Montreal, and a lot of people, had it's a tight-knit community. So if you can't break into that, it's really hard. So he makes a personal decision to move to Vancouver, which is, a lot more open to those sorts of ideas. And I think that's when you had that conversation with him.
Yeah, I had a conversation and so we're pitching him and saying, do you want to try and sell this? And we're trying to get a structure here because we don't have any money. So it's basically saying, if you sell it, we'll give you a big percentage of whatever you sell. Because we just need to, at that point, our main thing was we want to get content for these other publications or content from different places in the world. So he's trying that, and it's kind of going okay, but he's not sustainable at that point. He's not making enough money to do it full time. And somewhere I think I just said, I just need to jump on a plane and I'll figure it out. And I don't think there was no other plan. And it was probably also the incentive of, hey, I've never been to Canada. I'd like to go see Vancouver.
Again, all of those early trips were all self-funded. We kind of went, well, this is a holiday, but I can do work when I'm there, sort of thing.
But the reason it worked, I think the reason it worked, was I had mates in the airlines, and so I was getting staff travel discount. So I could fly the big long-haul flights really, really cheaply. And so it was like, I can get over there. And then Chris was saying, well, you can sleep on my floor. So, okay, I've got somewhere to stay. And in the early days, we were always very scrappy with our travel. But we get to Vancouver, and then I go, okay, now what? And Chris, I think, said, well, why don't we call up some architects and see if they'll take a meeting? Anyway, he starts calling up, and the story, oh, yeah, I'm here, and, this Australian has flown all the way over from Australia to meet architects. Would you take a meeting?
I think he might be insane.
And it turns out that when you have a crazy story like that, people take meetings. And so we started to book up all of these meetings. And then it became a game. Can we jump onto Instagram? Can we connect with more people? Can we see if we can get another meeting? We ended up meeting 3 to 5 architects every single day for, the better part of a month. And what we realized is, oh my God, all these people take meetings. And now they're signing up to BowerBird. They want to come use this thing. But more importantly, we would learn all the gossip of that entire city. We would learn who's doing what, which architects like this photographer, which photographers are sort of out of fashion, which architects some people like. There was all these cliques and groups and things.
Well, and this person, this couple used to run a practice together, and then one of them had an affair, and they now have 2 separate practices. There was a lot of that background info.
There were so many stories. And anyway, so this worked really well, and it was a lot of fun too. It was just so ridiculous. We got to a point where we would be walking down the street, we would see an architect's office, and we would joke to each other and say, should we just walk in and say hello? And we would walk in, and it's ridiculous, but by the end of it, people would say, oh, come in here and come into our kitchenette, you crazy people. And then we'd have a chat with them. And this led to what became our sales process all over the world. We called this parachuting into cities. And again, we are so naive. The way it started was, actually, did we just choose random places? Or maybe what it was you had built up the Instagram channel, and we put up a post saying, does anybody want to explore the world with
BowerBird?
So we're trying to leverage this idea that we don't have a lot of money. This is incredibly risky because you're going to have to work based on whatever you can sell. But it's kind of exciting. You get to travel the world and meet all these architects, and people signed up to it, to our complete surprise.
I mean, and I think having Chris there, he was he gave us some confidence because he knows sales, he understands sales. Again, that was some magical thing. We've since learned that it's like anything else. You just iterate and try different things until something works. But we had him there, and I actually don't remember the timeline of each city that we jumped into, but it was basically okay, we've got someone in Vancouver, so we can probably send him down to Seattle for a couple of weeks or down to Portland for a couple of weeks, and we can go and do that thing in that city. And then, I think that post on Instagram, was it Esther Rigo?
I think we got Esther on board because we wanted somebody to run the Instagram account for a day or 2 a week, and she came on board. And then we posted something about exploring the world, and I think she put her hand up. Can't remember how that happened.
No, I remember what it is. She was already using the platform because she was writing for a publication.
This paper, or a
this
paper?
This is paper house? I don't know, something like that. This is paper, maybe. Yes. Anyway, so she'd already used BowerBird and then obviously had followed us on Instagram and then saw that post and was like, "Oh yeah, I'll give it a go."
And just how scrappy this was we chose Zurich as a place to launch BowerBird. After Vancouver, I think we'd done Toronto because I flew over there with Chris to visit his family because we had somewhere to stay again.
Yep, that's right. Yep.
And then I don't know how it worked. I don't know if I kept hopping, but we chose Zurich because Esther's mum lives in Zurich, which meant that Esther got some free accommodation to launch there. Now, what we didn't know is that Zurich and Germany are probably the hardest places to launch tech. You know, that those few countries around there, they're not early adopters. So we got into Zurich and it was fun, like beautiful place. We're going to meet these architects. They really didn't get the Australian humor, like bit of a language difference, trying to make jokes, try to build rapport, realizing the Germans aren't really into that, or, you know, there's
or the ones that you met with weren't, yeah.
or maybe our jokes just weren't that.
No, it's not that. No, it's not that. Can't be that.
And I just remember trying to explain this to one of the architects in Zurich and them going, "So is this like a fax machine or is this like a newsletter that you send to people?" And I just go, "Wow, people still use fax machines. Like, we're way too early here. This is not going to work." But that for some reason, we must have been encouraged enough to keep doing it. Because
I think that's at the same time running parallel to that was, I was doing the sales in Australia. So we were still getting traction in Australia, you know, nothing compared to what we get now. But I was landing sales. So we were buoyed by that. And then Chris was also landing sales in Vancouver and the US. And so I think that was enough for us to go, okay, Zurich was the problem. It wasn't the product that was the problem.
And I think what we used to do was, because we still weren't getting paid, and every subscription we would get would go to funding somebody getting to a new city. And so Chris would do things like, "Okay, I found a couch surfing site and I can go stay at this person's house in this city, but I need a plane ticket. So can you pay for the plane ticket to get to here?" We're like, "Yeah, sure. Okay, we can fund that with our little bit of money." And then he would go meet all the architects again. And we were constantly doing this all over the world.
I think another practice that's worth mentioning was our first enterprise customer, which is Cox Architecture in Melbourne. And I remember that was a connection through the Victorian chapter. So that was when we went, okay, big practices need this too, not just little ones.
Yeah, Cox was really supportive.
Yeah.
I remember, because it came out of the awards, and then we go in there and they're trying to explain what they need and saying, "Do you have an enterprise agreement?" And we're like, what is that? Like, I have no idea what you mean.
I'm sure we could figure something out.
And I think it was Carly at Cox years ago. And she said,
Carly Young.
Okay, you go off and you figure out what an enterprise agreement is and then come back. And then
Carly in a way reminded me of Alison as well from the Institute. Just this idea of, like, I understand what you're trying to do. That sounds really interesting. You know, we want in on the ground floor, and we're willing to wait until you've got yourself sorted. You know.
Oh, and you know, so Cox was amazing. They were that first big practice, which helped us be able to demonstrate that we could go work with other big practices around the world. So forever grateful. The other firm that we haven't mentioned is 6 Degrees.
6 Degrees. Well, that's a great story.
Yeah. So you want to tell the story?
Well, so it was still in the days when we had a few plans. We may only have had 2 plans. It was like $29 a month, $99 a month. And then we had annual plans, which was a big commitment. That was $350 a year or $984 per year. So we're talking about big. It's like in our minds. So it's like, imagine the day when someone gives us $1,000. And I don't know how we ended up, it might have been through the awards, actually. I think it was, again, through the awards that we connected with them originally. And then we went to their office and met with them, and we met with James Legg, who's one of the principals there. We got to the end of the meeting and he's just like, "Yep, cool. We'll sign up. We'll sign up today." on the $984 plan, we'll give you $1,000. And I think as we were leaving the office, they literally signed up. James had put the credit card in and signed up. And we were just like, oh my God, someone just gave us $1,000.
Which, it's crazy because you try making a sale at $29. Like, it is a very hard game when it's more than your Uber to go and meet with somebody. And because we were naive thinking, well, this just will work out if, $29 eventually over time, that'll make sense. But when we realized that, okay, that doesn't work, like we will never be sustainable if we are, because as a small company, it's hard to survive on $29 per month. We're not the same as, a massive big startup that has 10 million users and they've been funded for 10 years and they can charge $1 a month. Like, it just doesn't work like that. And so 6 Degrees was that first time when we said, we need to change how this pricing structure works, and we need this can work. Like, if we can get somebody to come on for a year like that, then everything's going to make way more sense. The other people to thank is Ellenberg Fraser.
Oh, yep.
So Karen, I had known Karen from the Institute days, and walked in, pitched her, and she was the same. She just signed the check and just said, yep, let's get on board. And it was like, oh my God, enterprise, thank you for yours. Like, at the time, that money went into getting around the world, and
I think that was
it. A lot.
I think that was at 10,000 per year. I think that was and really the time between getting 6 Degrees, who were a lot smaller back then as well compared to Ellenberg Fraser. Getting someone to go, here's $10,000 was just, you're right. That was when we went, okay, we can do this. If you can go and get an enterprise in every city you go to, then you essentially pay for the
cost
trip
of going there. Yeah. So we were forever thankful for that as well. Just the trust, like the fact that we couldn't believe that. Like, when you start dealing with larger firms, you realize they're dealing with much larger budgets than this. But for us, when we were little, that meant all the difference. It meant that we could go launch in another city, or we could, relax a little bit to be able to fund all the servers and the all the other things that go into running BowerBird behind the scenes, which over the years has gotten bigger and bigger and bigger. But, the other fun stuff on the international side was we would get all these people who would say, I'll be a BowerBirder. I want to go traveling. We ended up with people in Argentina. So we had Elliot there, who was an Australian who was living in Argentina.
We basically expanded with Australian expats. That was how we.
We had Lucas over in Brazil, and again, it was like, how are we going to train them? We jumped on a plane, flew into Brazil, and just said, "Hey, let's go sell this in Brazil. Surely this is going to work." And what we learned really quickly is that not all economies are the same, and some are easier than others, and there's just hard lessons that go into all of this.
Yeah.
But they were all really fun. And then we come to a grinding halt with COVID slamming down the gate on travel. Like, I remember 2019. At the end of 2019, we had just flown as much of the team as we could out to Australia. So we must have been making enough money to get people out. We had a party at the Commons at QV. So there's a lot of people in Melbourne who came along to that. I'm sure Philly was there. I think Alison was there. Probably John Liu as well. Call out to John Liu.
Oh yeah, John Liu, in between architecture. I mean, he was one. I did his website while we were building this. I built his website for him and did the editorial for it. And he jumped on BowerBird. And I remember there's just one anecdote from him that I'll share, which is he got published. He got one of his projects published in the local Sunday newspaper in Melbourne on grand final weekends, Australian rules football. Grand final weekend, his house was in there, and he was stoked. And it's right, because a lot of people are getting the paper on grand final weekend and also keeping that paper for nostalgia. So yeah, he was on board really early and still continues to support us to this day. Yeah,
it's amazing how many of those stories we have around the world now of somebody who we will have met, and then again, when you take the effort to go visit people, there's a bond that forms. And that's one of the things I've always appreciated about BowerBird. And I hope we do more of it because, things have changed, which is, this is where the story gets harder, where we've gone through the initial stages where there's pushback on the initial idea. And then we hit COVID, where all travel stops overnight. We've got all these people out in Australia. And I remember seeing the news come through and going, there's something happening in China. And we had
novel virus, they would say, a novel coronavirus.
Yeah. And I was a bit like the crazy conspiracy theorist at the time in the early times, because I was going, we've got somebody flying through China because Esther was going back through there. And I said, there's something happening there. Like, we should be careful where we're routing, the BowerBirders. And, seems like crazy talk. And then obviously we all have COVID happening, but it meant all of our travel was cut off instantly. And so the entire way that we worked and meeting people I remember I do these videos internally called BowerBird videos, which is kind of telling the team about where the company is at and, trying to be as honest as we can. And I remember that BowerBird video going, I can't tell you what's going to happen in the next 3 months. Like,
we might not exist in 3 months.
Yeah, here's a chart. This is either going to be, there was nothing there that said this is going to be good. I think it was always going,
this is how much we can, mitigate the disaster of COVID.
Yeah, and like trying to do timelines of how long this might last for, or we had no idea what was actually going to come before us. And we had, at the time we were starting to grow and we were budgeting. Our travel budget was a lot. I remember that.
We budgeted $80,000 for travel.
Yeah.
I remember that, which back then was a salary, more than a salary.
That was more money than we knew what to do with at the time. And that was just, the operational costs of getting out to the cities to launch and then figuring out what on earth do we do. And
because you've missed a part of my personal story, which is that at the beginning of 2020, I'd moved to Bangkok because we'd gotten to this point. I think you were living in Cairns by then, and it was like, well, we can work remotely. We can work from wherever we are. And I was like, cool. My kid was 3 years old or something. It was like, cool. We can go and live in Bangkok for a year.
Which is good. It's good for work as well, because then you'd be in more countries.
Exactly. Yeah. And so, it was more about the lifestyle than anything else, because there's not a lot of highly valuable countries in Southeast Asia. But, beginning of 2020, cool. We're going to start our life here. But also in Australia at the end of 2019 was the worst bushfires we've ever seen.
Yes.
And so I remember I remember being in Melbourne the week before we left, and we were wearing masks because of the smoke. So we were wearing like particle masks for the smoke. We got to Bangkok and they had terrible smog. And so everyone was wearing masks. And then a few weeks in, COVID comes along, everyone's wearing masks.
Everyone's wearing masks.
So that's my memory of that. And it was so dystopian, like, everything just started shutting down. We were in this tiny little shoebox of an apartment because all of the communal areas had been shut down. And we made the decision in 24 hours to just go, right, we're moving back. We're going back to Australia.
Yeah. And I remember that time too, because we were evacuating. There was a time where we were trying to get everybody back from where they were. And so people like Elliot was trying to get back out of Argentina. So it meant that so technically he's still part of the BowerBird team, but he's having to come back and live in Australia. Or people were sort of bunkering down and we're just like, okay, what happens now? And at the time, people didn't pick up on Zoom. Like, this was this is the amazing thing is after that, we actually started to grow really fast because of Zoom. And before that, architects wouldn't take meetings on Zoom. Even if you tried to book it, they would just ignore it. There was no value there to not pick up. And it was amazing how, suddenly people are taking Zoom meetings. Everyone's talking about Zoom. They're forced into the remote world, which we had been living in for years. We had just been so remote. And suddenly we didn't have to go traveling. We could just book in a Zoom meeting and go, let's have a chat.
Yeah, and thankfully no one else could travel at that time either, so we didn't feel like we were missing out in any special way. But I mean, I think that was the interesting thing we talked about, because so much of what we were doing at that point was fun, right?
Yeah,
we were having fun. That's why people took this crazy journey with us because we were running around the world, parachuting into cities, and it was so much fun. And again, we were mostly spending our own money doing that travel, and that was great. You know, it worked really well with our lifestyle. And then almost overnight, it was like, well, how do we keep that fun going? Because you can't travel anymore.
It was hard. And the culture of the company was shifting so much. So we've started off with a very small culture where it's me and you. It's very get away from the work culture. And then there's sort of you're escaping from how businesses work. But as you scale, you get forced to become the business. You get forced to having to create that culture. And so in the startup phase, super exciting, very unstable, but everyone's having a great time, and it's just hacking anything you can or trying to get to any country you can, meeting with people. Some of the best stories of my life will probably be through that phase of just the random doors that open and you're in a piano recital in the middle of Berlin in some architect's office and you have no idea how that happened.
Like there's just an underground bat cave in Vancouver.
The underground bat cave. Like, just a story after story like that. And so we had to rebuild the entire culture. Like, we had to think about how things worked. We had to get more professional because in the early days we were very soft too. We had no idea how business worked. We probably weren't giving the structure that people needed. It was a bit like, you're figuring this out. You have no idea how this works and you trust that everyone's
and you're
trying
just
their
really,
best.
you're really attracted to these terms like, we've got a very flat hierarchy, flat structure and sort of going like, and I think at the time, because with our sales team, they had very high commissions, like an insanely high commission because they were taking on the risk. We weren't taking on most of the risk. Like people were moving to cities and doing all this stuff. And we're like, okay, we'll give you a lot of commission. But all of that kind of changes as time goes on, right? So you go from telling people, it's basically like running your own business. You get to go into a city and, you've got this awesome thing that you can sell. Like you're trying to convince someone that they should come on board with you. And then at some point, if your business is successful, it shifts and you're the one taking on most of the risk. And you need to go, actually, we need a bit more control over how the business works.
Yeah. And rather than relying on enthusiasm, because there's lots of people in the early days, everything was about enthusiasm. And we were just grateful that people put trust in us to try and go and try this new thing. But over time, we had to move to high performance, because it mattered. Every person in the company, it wasn't just fun and games. This was serious, especially when times get hard. When you've got growth, everything is a bit like, I guess you're just more wasteful with money because it's there. And you're softer with the people in your company in the sense of your expectations are lower because if they're happy and enthusiastic and you just enjoy being there, it was a really good moment in time. But when we were going through those transitions, this is serious. We need to make sure this thing survives. And that's the hard part of the journey. And we've had a couple of those over the last couple of years because as you get larger, this thing is bigger than you. In the early days, I always felt like I can just jump on a plane and I'll make this work. Yep. I'll figure it out.
Solve a problem.
Because
easy. Yep.
Because I don't have to move the needle very far. And the enthusiasm was enough to be contagious to that one other person. And as it gets larger, we had 45 people in the company at some point. We had people all over the world. We had BowerBird representatives in all these different countries and meeting with people and all this craziness. And then
Well, no, I was just going to say the reason we got to those numbers, though, was because we still hadn't quite figured out how to build the tech in the way that we wanted to build it. So what we did was we went, okay, this sales process is working. Let's just duplicate all of these people. And so we ended up very quickly having middle management, and that was the first time we'd ever done that.
Yeah, we had middle management and, like everything else in BowerBird, we had no idea what we were doing. This was the first time we were doing it and we were moving fast. And we were doubling. Every year we were getting twice as big, so exponentially. And so you're trying to hold on to this. It's like you're holding on to a rocket. And at the time, I was the only developer. And my time, we made a decision at some point to go, we need to focus on getting this out to the world rather than the product. And then we eventually had enough revenue where we said, let's go hire somebody And that's where Marco came on board, and he's still with us, first dev, still with the team. And then we were saying, we need more devs. We need to build a dev team. And we essentially just did best practice, which was we copied what other people say is best practice, which turns out to be terrible advice.
Yep.
And so we've built this team. We've got 5 or 6 developers now, all working on something using best practice and structuring everything. And they've got all these tools and they're listing out all the things they're going to do. And then nothing is happening. And we're starting to burn a lot of money and we're not getting much from it.
And the size of the sales team, like we had researchers, we had what we call bookers, appointment setters, we had closers, we had support team, and again, all of this stuff, like you think just about something like custom support, most of it was just plugging the gaps that we didn't have in our tech. It was like, okay, we need to explain this thing, we need to answer all of these questions. If you compare that to where we are now, like you don't need a big team to answer the questions because the tech is kind of solved.
Yeah, so we hit this phase where we had grown to this massive company because we were scaling and we were trying to maintain this velocity, and then we were burning more cash than what we were getting back. And we end up hitting this point where we go, we can see these red lights going on as you do in the startup world going, if we don't course correct, everything is going to explode.
Yeah.
And that's when that was probably one of the hardest journeys where we're going, oh, there's something, how do we manage this? Like, have I done something wrong here? At that point, until then, you just thought everything gets rosier and better and all those sorts of things.
Because it had. Historically, it had. Yeah, we've been doubling every year.
And we had to restructure. We had to let some people go. It was really sad. Because the other thing was our success had kind of been our downfall. We were all over the world. I think something like 10 or 20% of architects or publishable architects in the world have used BowerBird at some point. The amount of published content going through BowerBird now, like there's some percentage of all content that all publications use now that comes through BowerBird. And we had focused so much on architecture, and in the beginning, it felt like an endless amount of people and an endless number of projects. We just had to go find them. Eventually we found them all. We had a research team. We had 10 people dedicated every single day, trawling through the internet, looking for architects, and then trying to assess the quality of their work and what they did, and lining up meetings. Like there was a massive infrastructure.
Yep,
I can see the PTSD is
a little bit. Well, not even that. I think this is the lesson about scaling, right? So to anyone listening to this, I think architects generally know that scaling is almost impossible within architecture. Not impossible, but really difficult, which is why a lot of them stay small. But when you're talking about tech and scaling, when you decide to scale, so for instance, for us, this recipe was working. We had a sales team. They were able to get meetings. They were able to get subscriptions, make money. Everything was working right. So we said, cool. We don't know how we can do this with tech. That's a bit of risk. Doing the tech was the riskier thing. We just went, okay, let's just duplicate that structure and get that working all over the world. And when you add one person, it's going to multiply by 2. We just kept doing that. And what we quickly realized is that as you scale, every single component gets less efficient. I don't know if that's always true for all businesses, but for us, it was definitely like, oh my God, the efficiency dropped off by a substantial amount. So you got one person, you add another person, you might only be getting like 25% increase. That was bizarre.
And when you've scaled so far, things that break within your tech, which when you've got a handful of people that you know personally, you can pick up the phone and just say, oh, that's how you get around that bug or that issue. Now suddenly people are going, this thing sucks, or there's something broken. And with our dev team, because they're not able to build anything. They're all there, but the structure is every time they would work on something, it would get bigger and bigger. And it's like they're going to rebuild the entire app just to change this one thing. So we were stuck in this problem where we had all these customers and then we needed to fix things and we couldn't fix it. And that process went on for about 2 years until we started to feel this crunch phase. And that's what we've done over the last 2 years. We had to restructure everything. We had to basically go down to the foundations and say, how do we build a feature? And we built a whole new philosophy. We built up what we call skateboarding now, We push code every single day. We build tiny things. We move from the old culture of BowerBird into this new culture of high performance. Like every day matters. We need to get value for our customers. We need to solve these problems. And that's why suddenly that the whole team is shrunk, but now they can do so much more.
Well, I think what's been really interesting for me from sort of looking after the sales team, the efficiency now is 1,000 times higher. We are booking more meetings now per day with a team of 3 bookers, appointment setters, than we did when we had 8 across the globe.
Yeah.
Like if you take the time to step back, and those were hard decisions. And, I just want to say thank you to all of those amazing people who came on board during our scaling phase and the ones that we had to let go. Apart from anything else, they were also gracious. Sorry.
We are sorry for being so naive and not having any idea of what we were doing in the beginning.
Yeah, they were so gracious and they loved working at BowerBird. And, the number of those people who said that to me, as you're letting someone go, look, this is one of the hardest things you can ever do as a business owner. And I think if you don't find it hard, there's probably something wrong with you. Letting someone go, because you go into it with this sense that you never go into that idea of hiring someone or bringing someone on board with the idea that they'll only be there for 3 months. You go into it going, I want this person to be here for years. And if you feel like you've failed as a leader in that process, it's incredibly hard. And it takes up all of your mind as well for a really long period of time.
It was incredibly humbling. I remember there was a phase there where I was having to let go of people. I felt like I had failed in that process. And it's taken 2 years to rebuild that. And you realize, okay, that's part of personal growth where you have to go through some hard things. You have to step up. You have to take responsibility for it. And what it forced us to do is to build a whole new culture and to rethink those things from the ground up.
And not make those mistakes again. If you don't hate letting someone go, if you don't hate firing people, then you're condemned to repeat your mistakes. You now go, God, that was painful. I want to avoid having to be in that position again, or I want to avoid making that mistake again, knowing that you probably will be in that position at some point that you have to let someone.
One of the really hard things, which most people on the outside of BowerBird won't appreciate, is how complex what we do is, because we're dealing with essentially a marketplace of all these creative people and all these journalists. They're spread out all over the world. You don't know what they create. You don't know what they publish. You're trying to manage all these relationships, and you're trying to do that with tech to be able to make that efficient. And in the beginning, we were using humans to try to meet with people, to call people, to do things. And managing humans at that scale, trying to do that, things keep breaking as you try to build a process and you try to train somebody, and it works for a while, and then people fall back into old behaviors. And our saving grace with all of this was that AI came along, and all these things that, you posted this on LinkedIn yesterday. We used to do all these walk and talks around Collingwood and Melbourne, talking about all the things that BowerBird could be, and the tech wasn't there. It would have been very, very hard to do that. You could do it in a clunky way, like, hey, I'm going to match this project with this publication because it's got the same category. And then that journalist just gets dumped with hundreds of junky projects which don't match what they're after. It was very hard to code the nuance, especially because architecture has a quality factor. Like you used to run a team just dealing with the quality of projects. Isn't that insane to think back on?
Yeah, I think what's really interesting for me, these advances in AI, is quality used to be a subjective thing. We always sort of struggled with this thing. That's why we came up with the term publishable architecture. And the reason we said publishable, and there was always a caveat to that, which is publishable by the publications that we have on BowerBird. So all that early research from MediaMap was still the powering component of BowerBird. So we were like, okay, can this practice, and it was not just one project either, the practice had to have enough publishable work to match with enough of our publications that person got value. That is incredibly complex. That is not an easy thing to do.
Yeah, and you take it for granted that if you're involved in architecture, you can look at a project and go, that looks cool. I like that project.
Yep.
And you can see the nuance where you go, those photos look like it's real estate photography. not architectural photography. So that doesn't make the cut. And we were having to train teams to try to be able to make those judgment calls, but at a really large scale. You're talking about, thousands of projects. And that's where it was just really hard to train the nuance. And because there's pressure to get enough content. And so you're balancing these things, which are, I guess, subjective. They're not true false questions. And that's where AI, we were so lucky that AI had come in when it did, so that when we were going through the rebuild and we were going, we need to make BowerBird better. We need to build the things that we had talked about 10 years ago. And now we didn't even know that AI was going to be able to do it. But what we did know is that we needed to start somewhere. That was the whole idea 2 years ago, was let's build something today. I remember I was trying to build, I think we called it ArchiSpeak, and trying to build that. That's now a feature that's on BowerBird. But when we first built it 2 years ago, it was too ambitious. Everything we were doing it just gets so hard as you scale things up, trying to deal with hundreds of thousands of architects or publications. And
ArchiSpeak, the idea behind ArchiSpeak was you can write a story, essentially. You can write a story or write a description about your project using AI to do that. And it's so funny to think about where that started. And it was kind of, it was the initial idea that you could put in some text that was really academic, and it would change it into...
The idea that was you should be able to write about any piece of architecture anywhere in the world.
That's right.
Would AI know this? And then what we quickly came up against is when you build things at scale, things work for a certain percentage of the time, and then you have all these edge cases. And so you could be up at 90% accuracy, and if you miss the 10%, as a human, you feel like it's broken. And it was just a frustrating process. And so we had to develop a whole new way of thinking about how to program, how to deal with these sort of, I guess, just the inaccuracies of the world. Not everything is true or false, which is how old things were built. So there was a big learning process over that probably first 6 to 12 months. And now we've gotten really good at using AI, and it's changed everything that we do. It's allowing us to finally build the product that we had dreamt of and even do things that are new now to us.
Not to mention other parts of the business that use AI. We're using tools that have AI built into it, like Copilot for the coders, where they can do things a lot faster. The tech world has completely changed in the past 2 years. Completely.
Well, when you think about, for us, because all of this AI was language-based, it was all language-based models. For us, we're dealing with language. We're dealing with how do we get stories. And so our mission changed a lot. One of the things that really came up was the idea of how do we get the stories out of people's heads? We have this opportunity to do things like AI interview, which is now up on BowerBird, where it'll prompt questions and allow you to chat back and forth. And what we're really trying to do is we're trying to help people to get the story out of your head. Your 200-word description is not enough for a journalist to write meaningful stories. You have all of these people, all of these experiences, all of these little parts of what goes into building stuff, and they're trapped in your head. And we're trying to deal with that human process of trying to get somebody to click on a button to actually share that stuff, which comes back to the same problem.
I think what's in, just to come back to the story, we probably don't want to go into too much detail about the features. I mean, because we've got a lot to talk about in the future about the features. But I think for me, it's what's been amazing in the last 18 months, really, and the shift in how our tech team works. So in that period before that, we hired devs, and we were looking to completely rebuild old-fashioned sort of, okay, it's going to take us 6 months to build this new version of BowerBird. And I think we're looking at different technology as well to do that. And we did. We wasted time. We wasted serious dollars on trying to rebuild this thing.
Hundreds of thousands, maybe millions of dollars running a dev team, which wasn't able to release anything and deleting all of that.
Yep.
Isn't that crazy?
It's so funny because it's kind of the same conversation as the one in the cafe where it was, I'm going to drop all of this code that I've done and start from scratch. I mean, it's kind of, it was at that level, but with an ongoing concern that pays our wages. It was more than 6 months, so it may even have been 12 months. We spent essentially treading water. Not a single feature went up. Maybe we fixed bugs, but that was about it.
I think it was 2 years. I think it was 2
Really?
years. There was one feature, I think, which went up. Everything else got stuck waiting for the big launch of the next version.
And so now this new thing where we're literally pushing up features every single day. I mean, the amount that we've pushed up in the last 12 months, and I mean, it's been a complete rebuild without completely rebuilding. It's like all these little things change over time.
The other big shift was we started off with the perspective of being an architect, and especially small residential architect. So this is my problem that I'm trying to send out to journalists. And then we realized, let's flip that and come at it from the perspective of the journalist. And we've been building so many journalist tools, and we've changed our perspective on things. We've just released an exclusive tool, and we had always been against exclusives in the early days because we said, this doesn't make sense. You're locking down content for one publication. Then, the architect, they get bored of a project and they don't send it out to everybody else at the end of the exclusive. Again, now we've come to it from a different angle with AI on top of it. And we say, we can do both. We can do exclusives now. You want to do an exclusive? Great. When you finish the exclusive, we can automatically send out to the other publications now. It all just works better. And again, there's something about skateboarding. This is the process we use, doing everything every day, talking to people every day, and then going, what can we do right now to make it better? And you just get a lot of bites of the cherry. That's going out throughout the entire company now, whether that's somebody doing a meeting, whether somebody's picking up the phone. They're doing the same process. They're going, how do I get better every single day? And how do I make sure by the end of close of business, we've built something? And to me now, we're back in this exciting phase where you're like, somebody's knocking at your door.
Oh, you can hear that.
But yeah, it feels like we've gone through those hard phases. We've survived. We've learned a lot of hard lessons. And now we're at this exciting phase where we get to release the cool stuff and go, this thing can be really, really awesome. And we've now got the team to keep making it better over time. That's my take. How do you feel after all of that?
I feel like I need to answer my door, unfortunately.
We're probably reaching the 2-hour mark anyway. We've probably told enough of that origin story for people to get an idea of the joys of working from home. I reckon we'll leave that in. But 10 years. 10 years.
I've been wanting an on-air sign for a really long time.
To be able to put outside the door.
For me, it's that compression of the most activity seems to have happened in the last 2 years, but also feeling like we've figured so much of it out. The chaos, like skateboarding, I think for a lot of people, the idea of having a task that you need to complete every single day, you can't have any wasted days, but everything is achievable within a day, right? That might sound chaotic to some people, and all I feel is this calmness that comes from it, that every day something is being pushed up, every day you're trying something new, you're building, and that creates this calmness, which I think a lot of people would go, oh my God, I don't want that. I want to be able to plan my 12 months projects out. And I just look at how much we've been able to do in the past 12 months, 2 years, and you just go, that's 10 years worth of work compressed into one.
We'll do a whole other podcast episode just on that, I think. Just talking through that process and giving people an insight into how we're working now, because it just seems to work so well. But we are coming up to 2 hours. And we are kind of
2.5.
Yeah. So we are kind of at that journey. Like that is the journey where we started from, and all the hard stuff, and then trying to run a much larger company. And
if only Andrew listens to this, then it's been worthwhile.
Yes. And if we've bored everybody else, well, you've probably already turned off hours ago.
Yeah, no, look, I mean, for me, if I was doing my morning walk, this would have just ticked over to 3 mornings worth of walks. So look, that's fine. That's manageable.
Take your time and enjoy it.
Yeah.
Okay, folks. Cool. Okay. Bye.
Bye.